I'm overwhelmed with the welcome here. So it's indeed both an honor and a pleasure for me to be given the opportunity to speak in this very prestigious event. So thank you. Great appreciation for the Philippine Navy for the kind invitation for me to be here today. And it's always good to be back in Manila, especially since we have just finished the ASEAN summit here in the Philippines. A great year to be in the Philippines with it being the chairman of ASEAN. And with the realization of how important ASEAN is for all the countries in Southeast Asia. So it's indeed both an honor and pleasure to be back in Manila at this time around. I've basically been asked here to actually celebrate, not really on basically explaining about ASEAN, but more on trying to celebrate ASEAN. We heard a lot about ASEAN community, but this time around we're trying to deliberate whether or not ASEAN can actually be a maritime community. It's indeed a very interesting subject. Because you see, ASEAN is indeed, Southeast Asia is indeed a very maritime region. And whether or not we can actually create a maritime community in Southeast Asia is now a very indeed interesting prospect that we shall see in the future. This is basically the outline of my, my talk today. Basically explaining, Southeast Asia as a maritime region. And then talking about, this is the second part is the essence of my talk today, my remark today, which is about basically regional cooperation within ASEAN. The efforts that have been done to pursue an ASEAN community. I mean, we celebrate a lot about ASEAN community in 2015, and to what extent it has actually been achieved until now. The third part, we will discuss also about maritime connectivity because it's such a big issue now. Seeing, we understand ASEAN as a maritime region, but is it well connected? How does it relate, to the ongoing maritime connectivity agenda of, for example, the Maritime Silk Road of China? And then briefly about the challenges, and then next, last is on the way forward to a maritime community. So if you see, for my presentation is basically mostly talking about cooperation, which means that my presentation would be mostly on a sort of like on a positive note, talking about the good work, the cooperation within ASEAN. And maybe later on, Professor Thayer will follow up on the more pressing issues of the, real defense and security challenges in the region. So I'm pretty sure that we can reach some sort of a balance of remarks today. So you see, Southeast Asia is distinctively a maritime region and one of the most complex areas of maritime geography in the world. Practically all sea areas of Southeast Asia are enclosed territorial sea, exclusive economic zone, or archipelagic waters, which means this is a consequence of the extended maritime jurisdiction under the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Which means that, with this being most of the areas being territorial waters, there are significant consequences for maritime affairs in the region, particularly with regard to navigational regimes and the rights of duties of the coastal states. Consequently, almost all countries in Southeast Asia, if I don't say all countries in Southeast Asia, except for the landlocked country, have extensive maritime interests, albeit with differing degrees. Maritime issues are major factors both in relations between the regional countries in Southeast Asia and in relations between these countries and the rest of the world. Major straits and busy ports are important features of the Southeast Asian maritime environment. The archipelagical nature of the region and its relative lack of land-based transport infrastructure mean that shipping is extremely important in the region. This is just, my slide here is just a simple distraction because this is just basically trying to explain to you how important shipping is for the region. The region sits astride key access routes between the Indian and Pacific Oceans that are economically and strategically important to the economies of Northeast Asia, the United States, and the emerging maritime powers of Asia. The maritime geography of Southeast Asia creates numerous straits as well as other choke points for shippings. These straits occur both along the coast of mainland Asia, where the island chain presses close to the coast, for example, the Straits of Malacca in Singapore, and through the off-lying islands and archipelagos, for example, the Sunda and Lombok Straits through the Indonesian archipelago. So more than 50,000 vessels on international routes ply, for example, the Malacca Straits each year. Some of the world's busiest ports are also located in Southeast Asia or rely on maritime traffic through region's waters. Singapore Harbor, for example, has the largest container turnover in the world after only Shanghai, followed by other Chinese ports of Shenzhen and Ningbo, Chosan. Many of the ships bound for these ports or other major East and Southeast Asian ports, of course, would transit through the Southeast Asian waters. Additionally, many other vessels, including fishing boats, passenger vessels, and other types of vessels, would ply the region's waters regularly, every day. Not only in terms of shipping, not only in terms of the importance of being a sea lanes of communication, Southeast Asia is also rich in gas, oil, and mineral resources, and both onshore and offshore energy installations. Many of them are operating in many countries in the region. Companies extracting oil, gas, or other natural resources depend on offshore platforms or terminals along the coast from which the extracted goods are shipped to various destinations around the world. In short, the sea is an integral characteristic of Southeast Asia. You take the sea out, there is no more the characteristic of Southeast Asia. For the regional countries, this is reflected in the size of regional merchant shipping fleets, the dependence on seaborne trade and seafood, an emphasis on maritime capabilities in military forces, and the attention given to offshore sovereignty and maritime jurisdiction. You take away this peace and stability in the region, in the seas of Southeast Asia, then what would countries like the Philippines, like Indonesia, like Singapore would do in order to survive? So after understanding the importance of the sea to all the countries in Southeast Asia, what have these countries been doing? The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or the ASEAN, is the premier regional grouping in Southeast Asia. It is widely credited for its substantial contribution to making the region more stable and more prosperous than otherwise, might have been the case. ASEAN has also played a major role as sponsor for wider regional cooperation groupings, which provide forums for all the Southeast Asian countries and the major powers and other interested countries to discuss and coordinate approaches to regional issues. ASEAN's cooperation strategy has basically two key elements. First, ASEAN is seeking to deepen accord among its own members through the development of an ASEAN community, which we have discussed briefly at the beginning of my remarks, with three interrelated components: economic, political security, and social cultural. The second one is ASEAN is striving to consolidate its position at the center of cooperation in East Asia overall. So not only strengthening cooperation within the region itself among Southeast Asian countries, but it's also reaching out to its neighboring countries in the whole of East Asia. The complexity of maritime issues in Southeast Asia has been considered as one of the major concerns to ASEAN. Maritime cooperation is not new at all in the context of ASEAN. Historically, maritime-related cooperation existed long way, even since the establishment of ASEAN in 1967. For example, as early as the early 70s, there's the founding of the Southeast Asia Fisheries Development Center, or CFDEC. And then, the importance of maritime issues were kept repeatedly, continued to be mentioned over and over again in various ASEAN documents. So the acknowledgement of maritime issues being important, the acknowledgement that maritime cooperation has to be improved, is repeated in different ASEAN documents. For example, it was strengthened in the Declaration of ASEAN Concord II, or as we know, Bali Concord II in 2003. And then, of course, at the ASEAN Political Security Community, APAC Blueprint. And the latest document is what we know now as the ASEAN 2025 Forging Ahead Together. So the Bali Concord II was signed by ASEAN leaders in Bali in 2003. And in the document, you find, basically a reiteration that maritime issues and concerns are transboundary in nature, and therefore shall be addressed regionally in a holistic, integrated, and comprehensive manner. The ASEAN Vision 2020, so the one before the 2025, further confirms that, and would have a more strengthened statement towards the importance of maritime issues. So this is the document that I mentioned, the last one, about ASEAN 2025, Forging Ahead Together. I quote here paragraph 8.7 that says, basically this paragraph describes ASEAN as a community that enhances maritime security and maritime cooperation for peace and stability in the region and beyond through, first, ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism, and second, adopts internationally accepted maritime conventions and principles. So it basically, this paragraph then describes ASEAN as a community seeking to create what we understand as a closer maritime cooperation through basically two different platforms. So the first is the ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism, and second is the adoption of internationally accepted maritime conventions and principles. Furthermore, from the same document, ASEAN 2025, then inside the document, if you read it, then the three pillars of ASEAN, the APSC, the political security, the economic, and the social cultural would be further elaborated. And you see that in the document, the APSC Blueprint 2025, maritime security is heavily discussed in section B.6. I quote here. It says, APSC is to enhance maritime security and promote maritime cooperation in ASEAN region and beyond through the strengthening of ASEAN-led mechanisms and adoption of internationally accepted maritime conventions and principles. So again, the same paragraph is repeated here. And this section, the B.6 section of the APSC, again, then further divides its elaboration into mainly three different parts. The first one highlights the importance of the South China Sea. It says, the heading of the section says, maintain the South China Sea as a sea of peace, prosperity, and cooperation. And it would have a list of articles on how to actually achieve this objective. The second part, the heading says, to promote maritime cooperation to comprehensively address maritime issues. So highlighting on the aspect of maritime cooperation. And the last section, its heading says, ensure peaceful, safe, free, and unimpeded international navigation and overflight in accordance with relevant international laws. So basically, in ASEAN documents, at least this very latest document, you would find that maritime security is discussed in a very comprehensive manner. So not only talking about not only talking about challenges or problems, but it also talks about how to achieve there, how to promote cooperation, and in fact, it also even touches a very technical issues such as safe, free, unimpeded international navigation and overflight, and so on. So it's a very basically a very comprehensive document, which means that the ideas are there, but as usual for the ASEAN frameworks and how to actually implement any of the things that have already been included in different ASEAN documents. So what have ASEAN been doing? In which mechanism have maritime security been discussed? ASEAN is strengthening maritime cooperation in the region as part of the community building that we know. At present, there are, correct me if I'm wrong if you know any more of this, but at least there are 10 groups of maritime issues discussed in 12 ASEAN sectoral bodies. I will highlight that there is not one ASEAN ministerial or sectoral body that discusses maritime security per se, but maritime issues are discussed within 10 group of maritime issues in 12 different ASEAN sectoral bodies. So maritime issues is seen as a whole, so there is no part that discusses only maritime security, but it discusses as a whole maritime in 12 different ASEAN sectoral bodies. So you would find some in the APSC, you would find some in the economic pillar, and maybe there are also some in the socio-cultural pillars. These 10 issue groups are cross-cutting and overlapping. These are mostly centered on ASEAN-led processes. So the first platform that I mentioned in the paragraph in the ASEAN 2025, which is achieving maritime cooperation through ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanisms. So this include, for example, the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Meeting, the AMM, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the IRF, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, and the PLUS, and the East ASEAN Summit. And in addition to the above, 3 other official level frameworks provide a venue for policy dialogues and consultation. First, as part of the ARF working group, there are the ARF Intersessional Meeting on Maritime Security. It was set up in 2008 and met for the first time the following year with the aim to develop concrete and effective regional responses to maritime security challenges. There is also the ARF Intersessional Meeting on Counterterrorism and Transnational Crime, where maritime security issues is part of. And the second platform is the ASEAN Maritime Forum, or the AMF. This is a mechanism that was established in 2010, and it reaffirmed, and I quote here from the document, it says, maritime issues and concerns are again transboundary in nature and so on, and maritime cooperation between and among ASEAN member states shall contribute to the evolution of the ASEAN security community. I will discuss more on the ASEAN Maritime Forum later. The third one is the AMF, the Expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum, or the EAMF. So the first one was held back-to-back with the third of the ASEAN Maritime Forum. Now, the expanded part, of course, then include ASEAN plus its dialogue partners, the same countries that also exist within the East Asia Summit. The EAMF is designed to encourage a dialogue on maritime issues that would involve the East Asia Summit participants and build upon the existing ASEAN Maritime Forum. So I emphasize this, which means the expanded one is built upon what's already going on in the ASEAN Maritime Forum. So ASEAN should be the drive for the expanded one, but it involves, the larger participants of the East Asia Summit. The initial meeting seems to have gotten off to a good start, and they discuss a number of issues relevant to existing maritime concerns. The core work, method, and activities in both of these forums mirror that of the ARF meetings on maritime security. Although this particular ASEAN Maritime Forum and expanded one, they maintain that their orientation should not be only security-centric, addressing also issues such as the promotion of business through maritime cooperation and establishment of linkages to support ASEAN connectivity. So again, in both forums, maritime is discussed as a comprehensive subject, so security is only one part to be discussed within the AMF and the EAMF. So I will stop the discussion on cooperation here and move on to connectivity, but I would later on try to discuss more on how any of these forums are existing now. Now, why am I discussing maritime connectivity? Of course, we want to talk about an ASEAN community, or in this regard, on the topic of that I'm asked to speak now, and also I see it as a big topic of the symposium today. If we want to have a sense of a maritime community, then of course, all of the islands in the archipelagic Southeast Asia have to be connected. Is it connected now? I don't think so. Even, I'm based in Singapore now, but I'm originally from Indonesia, and even the islands of Indonesia are still very badly connected. So it is the collective interest of ASEAN to deepen cooperation across all fronts, including, maritime security and cooperation, as well as maritime connectivity and protection of the maritime environment. So that's another issue. So indeed, in the path towards a community, it is obligatory that connectivity becomes one of the priorities. So you can't only talk about cooperation on security, but then if the region is so badly connected, then how are you going to achieve further cooperation in the security front? So over the past few years, regional connectivity has been at the top of ASEAN's agenda. In 2010, ASEAN hammered out its own master plan for ASEAN connectivity, or the MPAC. So this is the document you see on the screen on your left, which is a groundbreaking guideline to orchestrate a concerted effort to promote regional linkage. And then, 6 years later, in September 2016, the new Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2025 was adopted to boost the process. So these two documents are linked. The second one is thought to be an improvement or more on an implementation basis of the first document. Maritime connectivity is an integral element of the MPAC, as mirrored in one of the strategies, namely, and I quote from the document, to accomplish integrated, efficient, and competitive maritime transportation. The document also designated 47 ports as the main ports, whose capacity would be improved. ASEAN has also kickstarted the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund, aimed at assisting the financing on infrastructure projects in ASEAN. This infrastructure fund is projected to grant loans of at least $300 million per year, but the infrastructure needs in the region stands at a lot more than that. Plus, it needs to expand its capital base. At the maritime front, you see the master plan of ASEAN connectivity, focuses on connectivity on all areas, but since we focus here on maritime connectivity issue, there has been some success, there has been some lacking behind in some of the projects, but one of the success has been the ASEAN roll-on roll-off network, which has improved connectivities in the sea channels, which helped to reduce shipping time by over 50%. If you follow the news, just before the ASEAN summit a couple of weeks ago here in Manila, the Indonesian president signed the further commitment for the Indonesia Philippines roll-on roll-off network to basically improve the connectivity between the two countries, especially in terms of shipping and trade. So this is very much connected. If you see the different agreements between ASEAN countries, these are all related to the big master plan of the ASEAN connectivity, as we see here in these two documents. So those are the two fronts, basically ASEAN cooperation and the ASEAN connectivity, or the efforts towards an ASEAN connectivity. So a very common question to ask, what are the challenges? Well, ASEAN has attained quite a high, I would say a high international profile, since the establishment. Some success have been made, also a lot of problems have been encountered. However, pursuing cooperation among its very diverse members has never been an easy task, and I think it's recognized throughout the whole ASEAN framework. Realizing a closer and more integrated Southeast Asian region still remains a challenge for ASEAN. Regional cohesiveness requires deep linkages for a stronger region. ASEAN has struggled with the challenge of trying to both deepen cooperation and maintain unity when its members remain highly sensitive about their own rights to national sovereignty, an old issue for Southeast Asia. The major differences among its members in economic structure and political systems continue to pose major challenges to cooperative efforts. It is difficult to pursue, for example, economic integration policies among members whose economies and administrative capacities vary so widely. The same way, it is difficult to develop approaches towards the definition and promotion of human rights values and principles when the governments of members vary so widely as well. In the past decade, ASEAN's efforts have been dented by incidences of conflict between members, plus the pressure in relation to competing territorial claims. Moreover, the implementation of ASEAN agreements reached is still at a very minimum. A survey reveals that only 30% of commitments made among ASEAN member states are actually implemented. So 30% is a very low number. The main problem applies to throughout the whole ASEAN framework. There is no central mechanism to enforce compliance. That's why the very low number of 30%. This has seriously impacted ASEAN's community building. On the maritime security front, albeit all the frameworks, the mechanisms that I've explained in previous slides, ASEAN's underdeveloped arrangements confront a number of challenges. So although there is a multitude of meetings, you can ask the ASEAN Secretariat how many hundreds. There are more meetings in ASEAN than the number of days it is in a calendar year. So it's, if I can't imagine working, for example, in the Foreign Affairs Office when you have, attend so many meetings and there are only so many, people actually working there. So although, the focus of these different meetings, these different frameworks is different platforms, purports to be very comprehensive. There is only so much that ASEAN can do, with all the challenges that I've mentioned before, all the sensitivities. For example, on the maritime cooperation, you see all these different frameworks trying its best to discuss maritime comprehensively, but then again, on some of the platforms, discussions would be impeded because there are sensitive security issues, and that's always been a problem within ASEAN. The format of the work of all of these platforms is very much directed at nurturing policy dialogues, exchanges of views, and country briefings. So not so much, again, on the implementation part of it. Accordingly, it is process-oriented and based on organizational practices familiar to ASEAN, where there are no program-based activities or projects being planned in a systematic manner. So if you remember my previous slide about there are 10 groups of maritime issues discussed in 12 ASEAN sectoral bodies, then you would question, because these are overlapping and cross-cutting among these 12 different ASEAN sectoral bodies, then you would question, how do they work together, these different bodies, these different platforms, these different frameworks. The problem with ASEAN, and not only on maritime security issues, that there is lacking the coordination needed to actually make all of these different frameworks work together and ensure that there are no overlapping results, no overlapping issues that are discussed. And that is, again, this is not exclusive on maritime issues, but overall in ASEAN, coordination has always been a problem. Basically, looking at this, then you ask, with these challenges, one can get very pessimistic about it, but then again, you can ask, what is the way forward? Again, I repeat, the key to understanding Southeast Asia lies in an appreciation of its archipelagic nature. Again, I repeat, archipelagic Southeast Asia includes of more than 24,000 islands, which have to be connected, but is still badly connected at the moment. It's spread across 5,200 kilometers from the east to the west, and 3,400 kilometers from north to the south. So basically, once we look at the sea as a connector, not so much as a barrier, then you can start talking about this, connectivity issues. The sea can be both a connector and a barrier. It can be both a resource and a challenge. It depends on how you work together to actually make sure that the connector part and the resource part is more of an issue in Southeast Asia. What needs to be emphasized is that community building is a very hard process. It's a long, hard process. ASEAN is still in the process of building a community on land. So that's why I'm putting a question, a big question mark on the topic of maritime community. Because you see the whole ASEAN framework, you see the whole ASEAN Community 2015 can we really say there's already an ASEAN Community 2015? I would say that ASEAN is still in the process of building a community on land. So a community at sea is still a few steps ahead. So it's very difficult to imagine having a community on the maritime front when all the islands of Southeast Asia are still, again, badly connected. So leaders of ASEAN at the, for example, at the summit in 2015, already formally established the ASEAN community. The realization of this is a momentous milestone in ASEAN history, but has met with lukewarm responses from various sectors of ASEAN society. So this emphasizes all the key challenges that still exist. Despite the hype of the pro-community public pronouncements at the regional and national level, ASEAN is unlikely to become one single community anytime soon. Scholars suggest that it is preferable for ASEAN integration and community building to remain ongoing as a long-term aspiration that may or may not be fulfilled very soon, and that ASEAN should rid itself of a very narrow focus objectives like becoming a single community by putting deadlines, a certain date, 2025, 2030, or so on. It should focus its limited resources and attention on strengthening its capacity and effectiveness in immediately relevant roles. So in sum, and this is basically to summarize my presentation, at the maritime front, instead of imagining ASEAN as a maritime community, where it's hardly a community at land, I suggest that ASEAN focuses on two issues. First, at the political front is strengthening maritime cooperation, including maritime security. And second, on the physical front, on building on maritime connectivity. Maritime cooperation is an indispensable condition for the economic security and well-being of Southeast Asia, while at the same time, maritime connectivity ensures that the Sea of Southeast Asia is a connector instead of a barrier. These are what Southeast Asia urgently needs at the moment, in the midst of its efforts towards becoming an ASEAN community. So ASEAN as a community should be a long-term aspirations. If we don't achieve it now, then so be it. But we we focus our efforts on things that are important now and immediately relevant for ASEAN at the moment. And I suggest, concentrating our focus on these two fronts, the political in the strengthening of maritime cooperation and the physical front, which is building on maritime connectivity. I will stop my remarks here, and I look forward to discussion later on. Thank you so much.